Hello and welcome to the PhD Life Raft podcast. I'm Emma Brzezinski and today is a bit of a different one. I was invited by South West and Wales Doctoral Training Programme to be part of their Summer Research Festival and record an episode. And so this is it. It is a conversation with the marvellous Laurajane Smith. And we ended up talking about what to do and how to negotiate it when you are disagreeing with your supervisor. And we talk about how to negotiate that. We also talk about conference culture, and we also get into machismo archaeology. So I do hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, Laurajane.
Hi.
And hello, everybody else, because there's a bigger audience for today. This is truly an experiment because we are coming to you from SWWDTP's Summer Research Festival, South West and Wales Doctor Training Partnership, if you're not in on that acronym, which is very exciting. And we're going to see how this goes. So we have an audience for this conversation, which we don't usually have. And the other part of the experiment is Laura and I are on a bit of a kind of blind date because we've been set up to talk to each other today. But we've had a bit of a pre-chat, and I think it's going to be good. I've got a feeling it's going to be good. So welcome to this experiment. And welcome to you, Laurajane. Thank you so much for being willing to be part of this.
No worries. No worries.
So we are going to start, as we always do, with you telling us a little bit about your journey into the PhD, through the PhD and out the other side. How was it for you?
Okay, well, I mean, it was like every PhD journey. It was a rocky road with ups and downs, and that's all part of the, that roller coaster ride was all part of the, if I can mix my metaphors, all part of the reality that is the PhD. And my undergraduate degree was in archaeology, and in the 1980s, so quite a while ago now. And during the 80s, I worked as what you would call in England as a field archaeologist, what we call in Australia as a heritage consultant. And I became very interested as I was working in the field about the tensions that arose between Indigenous peoples with whom I worked and heritage experts and the state in terms of the way that they administered heritage legislation and policy and so on. And there was considerable tension in the 1980s about this. And I wanted, I was, having been caught in the middle of this, I wanted to understand the process. So I went in search of, I thought I will do a PhD. I wasn't at that point specifically interested in becoming an academic. I was interested in finding out what I had gotten myself mixed up in. Having only got a 2-1 in my honours year, what we call an honours year in Australia, I was not eligible for scholarships, and I had a lot of difficulty finding someone who would take on what in the 1980s was seen as a particularly contentious and difficult topic, because I wanted to look at the memory politics, I wanted to look at the heritage politics of Indigenous and archaeological relationships. Then I was extremely lucky, as chance had it, an advertisement for a academic position came up at a place called Charles Sturt University. No one will have heard of it, but it was a rural university in Australia. And I got the job, unbelievably, without a PhD. But the condition was that I do the PhD to retain the job. And so I went back to my old the university which I'd done an undergraduate and said, I want to do a PhD. And they said, all right, of course, we'll allow you to do it. And we're giving you this supervisor. So my poor supervisor we didn't really negotiate. So she was she and I were sort of thrust by circumstances together, and she wasn't entirely convinced by my topic, and it not least because it was at the time a contentious topic. You know, Indigenous politics were kicking off. Archaeologists were under fire for their the colonialist position that many of them held at the time. So I did my PhD in a context, as I said, where my supervisor wasn't entirely on board. She got there in the end, and at a time when I was testing my ideas, as you do as a PhD, at conferences where the audience was hostile, to put it mildly. I mean, it was also a time too when the discipline was even more, to be frank, sexist than it is today. In Australia, archaeology is, it's a very machismo discipline. You know, you could actually say the Indiana Jones movies that came out in the 1980s, were a bit of a documentary there, or if not a documentary, something to aspire to. Every male archaeologist I knew seemed to want to wield a whip. But
there's a whole other episode there, machismo archaeology.
But I mean, I remember, quite traumatic incidents giving papers on my PhD and my, because I was doing it part-time, over a 6-year period, men in the audience standing up and screaming at me or screaming at other female researchers as well. No, you cannot do that. So it was quite stressful, but, I began to realise, actually, no one's died. This is not, I can actually use this situation, and it actually, having a supervisor that was not entirely convinced by the topic, and having done the research at a time when there was a lot of tensions, I think made me a stronger researcher. It certainly made the PhD tighter, because I had to really argue. I had to really think about, what is it that I'm saying? What is it that I'm arguing? And how do I get it across? How do I convince not just the examiners, but my supervisor, the broader archaeological discipline in which, the Australian discipline in which I was working. I was also lucky in that I had a captive audience of my students. I tried out ideas in the lecture theatre as well as I went along. So yeah, and it's something that has stuck. It's something that has stuck with me as I throughout my academic career, both as in terms of thinking about my lectures and writing and delivering my lectures and writing and writing, my academic work, writing up my academic work, is I've always written thinking about or imagining someone that I know who takes an entirely oppositional position to my own, and to write to that person to convince them of the usefulness of my position. And I think, and that's been very useful. And it's something I also tell my own PhD students: imagine someone who is not with you, who is, taking a different position, and write to them to convince. And I think that makes for a tighter argument. Yeah.
Well, I am so sorry to hear that you had that experience. I mean, it's just awful, because you spend a lot of time saying to people, don't worry, conferences, you're gonna get some positive feedback, and then there you were getting screamed at by people. Yeah,
it's changed. I mean,
yeah.
That's right. I think there is a significant difference these days
Yes.
in the way that conferences are run, not least because there is a generation of feminist researchers who said that behaviour in conferences is not okay. Conferences should be places where we can engage in the exchange of ideas and be constructive in our criticism. And I think that is significantly changed. And I would echo that point. I do, say this to my students. And if someone, again, and I also say, as it dawned on me in these experiences, is if you have got someone who is so deeply emotionally reactive to what you're saying, think about, well, I must be onto something here. I've hit a nerve. They wouldn't be so distressed, so angry with me if they didn't really actually know I was right. That I had, I had something to say here that is important and meaningful at some level. So, these days I actually quite enjoy when people get really angry, because I think, aha, yeah.
Was that really, academia is a very emotionally heightened environment, isn't it? And people do get very passionate. But let's keep it respectful, people. So we agreed that what we were going to talk about was this situation where you are taking a kind of different route or a different approach to the material than your supervisor, because this happens very often, especially at the end of a PhD journey, as you are coming into the expertise. You are now the expert. You will know more than your supervisor. You'll be ahead of them, but this can then become sometimes quite problematic in terms of the differences. So having been through the experience that you did, where from the get-go she wasn't quite sure, and again that will be true for some people who are listening, what are your kind of thoughts or reflections on that, on working with a supervisor who may be taking a different approach to you?
Well, again, enjoy the debate. Go into a supervision, be ready to debate and enjoy the debate. Engage your supervisor, get them, because most academics get into academia because they enjoy debate. And sometimes we forget about that as we drown in the minutiae of administrivia that, tends to get thrust upon us in academia these days. We forget about that. But if you can awaken that passion to debate and explore ideas, and any good supervisor will be, oh yes, of course, and will begin to enjoy the process. I know I do with my students, because of course they can't, as you say, they become the experts in their particular topics, and that's fun. I really enjoy that part of the supervision, that debate and discussion. So don't be afraid of that,
because I think it is a compliment, I think, as well, isn't it? And that is not always expected. I think this kind of academic route, still building on that Socratic tradition, isn't it, of kind of having argumentation. Now, we might have a discussion about, where that takes us and how useful that is. But I think that if your supervisor, that sense, like you were saying, if your supervisor is opening up a debate with you, that is a compliment. And you have to kind of run that through Google Translate in your mind and go, oh, actually, it's not because I'm wrong. It's because they're interested in kind of exploring.
Absolutely. And they're treating you as a colleague. It's the point at which your relationship from student to supervisor is changing. As you become a colleague, you're being, that engagement of debate is recognising the legitimacy of what it is that you are saying. They may disagree with what you're saying, but they're recognising the legitimacy of the research, of the weight of scholarship behind what you've done, to be able to, to take a position that is a legitimate position worthy of debate and discussion. So absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. And I think it's like you were saying, that actually when you're entering into debate, it's because you're seen as a colleague. Academics love to do this with each other. We've sat in our faculty meetings, Laurajane, you and I, and I'm sure people are listening as well. People love to debate. I remember sitting in a meeting, it went on for about an hour in terms of people discussing where the toilet should be positioned, because academics just love to, get into it. So this sense of that disagreement being a compliment, actually. But I wonder when if things become a bit more tricky and you feel like someone's stopping you, which isn't necessarily your story, but if you feel like someone's actually shutting down your work, I wonder if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things about my own PhD as well is that I did it in isolation. So I was at the time 7 hours drive from my university where I was doing my PhD. So I was living in rural Australia, 7 hours from Sydney, and And in those moments where there was, I was being shut down either by colleagues or whoever, and in those moments that every PhD student goes through, where at 3:00 in the morning, the abyss is staring back at you and you're wondering, what have I done? What have I got myself into? How, what am I arguing? What is a thesis? All the other insecurities that come flooding in. Being isolated, I realized how important your peers were. So I was lucky in that I had a very supportive partner who is also an academic, so helped me through the process. So that was really important that we could have that supportive discussions with each other. He was doing his PhD as well, so that was significant. But it also brought home to me the importance of your peers as a PhD, that the people around you are a very important source of affirmation about what you're doing and why you're doing it. They're also a very important emotional support. And, I mean, as is having copious amounts of chocolate and alcohol at hand, but your peers are really an important resource for not only getting you through your PhD, but getting you through your career, because they will be there. You will all get there. You'll all graduate, and they will be down the track the people who will peer review your articles, who will be on granting bodies, and vice versa. So developing that network of support and camaraderie and collegiality was something that I missed out on doing my PhD 7 hours drive from Sydney. But, I saw it in action with my cohort who were in Sydney, and I've seen it in action with students that I've since supervised. And I think that's really, really important, a really important resource to help deal with that being closed down. And the other issue in response to being closed down is to believe in yourself. I mean, you were doing the research, as you said, just doing the PhD, you will become the expert, and you've done the research. Believe in the legitimacy of what you're doing, and don't back off. If people are closing you down, if they're coming at you, then maybe it's because they're insecure. Maybe it's because actually you do know what you're talking about. We like to think in academia, you said, Emma, that academia is a very highly emotional, and of course it is. We tend to not remember that. We tend to say to students, "Oh, get a thick skin," where I'm criticising your ideas, not you as a person. But in academia, that's part of who you are. Your ideas are who you are. This is emotional.
Yes.
Don't belittle that. It is part of our identity, and just be aware of that. Affirm that. It's okay. It's okay to feel pride. It's okay to feel unease. It's okay to feel disappointment and all these sort of things, or to be unsure. Because emotions are part of the ways in which we think, and they're integral to cognition, they're integral to memory making, all that sort of stuff. Yes. So engage with that.
And I think that equally is where it's really, really useful to have people around you. And as I could see on my screen, I could see people together in a room, which is awesome. But to have people who are around you to reflect that back, that they found that difficult too. They're struggling with that too. Yeah. They're excited about that too. And so you can kind of have that mirrored back to you as kind of normal, because I think often people think, oh, it's just me feeling this, it's just me responding in that way. And it won't be. So I think this sense of collegiality really, really important. And the belief in yourself is a challenge, isn't it? Because as you say, you're putting yourself out there. This is these are your precious ideas which are conjuring up, and you put it out there. And so again, that's where your peers can be really useful, or safe people can be really useful to rehearse those ideas, get some feedback on it in a really safe environment before you take it out into the world. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, people, as people say, grow a thick skin, and you do need to grow a thick skin. You do need to be able to take that criticism and not become a, distressed, quivering mess. And you get that with practice, but you also get that by getting in touch with your own emotions and accepting, it's okay, it's all right, I can do this, and what I'm doing is valid, and learning. And I think one of the hardest lessons for me, and I still struggle, is learning to take compliments. Is learning, I can deal with the
Nice.
adversarial, critique and criticism, but it's the compliments that I sometimes find harder to deal with, and I think particularly for women, that's something we need to learn to do. That it's actually okay to feel like, I've achieved something, I can do this, and have that.
And this is where I think your conference buddies, particularly around conference behaviour, can be really useful. To have someone who's writing down the positive things that people say after your paper, because you will forget them, and all you'll hear is the person saying, I didn't like that. But hopefully there will be positive things, and even if it's your conference buddy saying the positive things, or telling people were nodding when you were saying that, or I really liked that, to have that and feed that back to you, and also knowing that there's somebody there in the audience that if something does happen, they will call it out and say, actually, it's not okay. This whole thing of like, that's a comment, not a question. It's like, that's not okay. It's not okay to be parading your whatever in front of me rather than really responding to my material. There's a lot about behaviour which you can call out, and I think knowing that people are around who are going to call that out for you, I think is really, really important. And as you say, I think
conference buddies are really important, and one of the things that I and my fellow PhD students used to also do is break the ice. So we would have someone sitting in the audience to ask the first question for you before the God professor, for instance, came down on you with their wrath. You had a friendly face ask you the first question, break the ice. So that's another way that conference buddies can be used. But they're really important, writing down the questions, both good and bad, so that you can remember them and think about, okay, what does that mean? Getting that criticism and constructive criticism, and thinking about, how can I improve my research? How is that helping me do the feedback?
Really taking care of each other and just bringing that ethics of care, and we can shift things. So I'm aware of time. It always goes really quickly, and you've already given us some really practical things to think about, but I wonder if you have any other sort of top tips for people around this, particularly maybe around this idea of if you're going in a different direction, or you're finding yourself in contentious territory, or more generally.
I mean, I guess it's always really important to be self-reflexive. Is the direction I'm going actually somewhere that is taking me? I'm being led to through the research that I'm doing, or have I gone down a rabbit hole? Because of course, as a supervisor, I know it's very easy for students to go down rabbit holes and lose themselves. So I think that self-reflection, being able to think about where you're going and why, and am I being led there by the data and so on, and that's a useful thing to debate and discuss with your supervisor as well. So sometimes the criticisms can be they're not on board with you yet, like it was for me particularly at the beginning of the research. But sometimes it is because you've gotten an enthusiasm and you've gone off track. So being able to be self-reflexive about what you're doing and why and where you're going is really, really important, and not to be afraid of that. It's also not to be afraid of making mistakes. We all make mistakes. We all get it wrong. Be prepared to recognise that when that happens.
Yes. Oh, yes. And self-reflexivity can come in all sorts of forms as well, isn't it? So people might journal, or they might use their peers to feed back to them, all sorts of ways, and to think about that. Laurajane, thank you very much. I feel like, this would be I'd like to ask you for a second date, because I feel like, we've been set up. Would it work? Would it not? It's been truly a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you also to SWWDTP for hosting us and bringing more people into the room. Thank you all so much, and thank you all for listening.